Hello, fellow humans, and welcome back to Beyond Words, conversations on language, music, and the mind. The following is a conversation with Dr. Meg Cychosz, a linguist and developmental scientist at Stanford, whose research explores how children acquire language, from babbling in canonical proportion to cochlear implants in multilingual learning environments. We talk about why babbling matters, how children develop speech in the face of sensory differences like hearing loss, and how even coarse-grained measures like canonical proportion can reveal deep insights into development. We also dive into her work with large-scale recordings across cultures and discuss what this data is teaching us about the robustness and variability of early speech. Meg shares findings from her work with children in Bolivia, India, and across the US, and we dive into how deaf and hard of hearing kids experience language differently, sometimes in ways that challenge common assumptions in both science and therapy. From tiny vocalizations to big questions about communication, this is an episode full of wonder, nuance, and practical insight. So what lies beyond the words we speak? Tune in and find out. Dr. Cychosz, welcome to Beyond Words.
Hi, thank you. Thank you very much for inviting me.
Well, it's great to see you. And I just always start with asking the guests a little bit about their origin story, and was wondering how you got interested in this field.
My PhD is in linguistics, and so I think like a lot of linguists, you get really and you become like a language nerd. And so in my case, in high school, I I took like as many foreign languages as I could, which means I took French and Spanish. But I was very obsessed with like looking at similarities and differences between them. I taught myself Spanish, and then I went and when I was a teenager, I went and worked as an au pair, which is like a nanny in Spain. And I ended up working in a part of Spain where they speak two languages because I worked in Catalonia. And so that was really interesting, like watching kids kind of navigate a multilingual environment and acquire multiple languages. Um, and I think I was always just very interested in the science of language development. I think from a very young age, my mom was a kindergarten and first grade teacher. And so she would talk a lot about kind of like the science of literacy, which is, of course, highly tied to language development. So I think there was always something in the back of my mind that was very interesting about that to me.
Very cool. Did you grow up speaking any other languages in the home?
No, I grew up in a very small monolingual town in Wisconsin.
Got it. Yeah, that's so cool. I feel similar in a way in that like languages just there's this fascination with languages, and once I started learning them, it really just piqued my interest in so many different ways. But maybe we could start simple and talk about pre-language and start talking a little bit about babbling, because I feel like it's often missed in the speech and language therapy conversation. But yeah, maybe we can start a little simple and talk about what babbling is, and specifically what makes canonical babbling so special from a developmental standpoint.
Yeah, babbling is absolutely fascinating in so many ways. It tells you, I'm super interested in it a lot from like an articulatory standpoint. So what does it tell us about the infants developing speech motor control and how their vocal tract is being reshaped over time? All infants vocalize, all typically developing infants will vocalize from birth, but um, this ability to like watch as their speech changes over time and as they're kind of like tuning into their environment and the sounds around them and eventually the language around them is I often describe it as like it's one of our first ways of understanding how infants are making sense of the world around them and then reflecting it through their vocal tract for spoken language. Of course, we find babble as well. And canonical babbling is the ability to combine consonants and vowels together. That's typically how it's defined. And it's a really, really important motor milestone, the ability to make constrictions in the vocal tract as opposed to just having resonances come out of an open vocal tract without making any constrictions with like a tongue or an articulator or something. And then, so the ability to not just go, but the ability to move your tongue and make a constriction like duh or something like that. And then the ability, of course, to combine those together is another major milestone. And that is the canonical babbling milestone. And so it's, of course, you know much more about like the relevance or how much babbling is talked about in the speech therapy world, but there's been a huge movement in the last, I would say, like 10 or 15 years about babbling as this biomarker, right? Babbling as a biomarker for autism in infancy long before we can actually behaviorally assess children and diagnose them with an autism spectrum disorder. Babbling is a biomarker for hearing loss, for example. So, like, it is true that children with hearing loss babble, but there's complexity with that. So, a lot of times, for example, children with profound deafness will not babble, or they will make speech-like vocalizations, but they won't be the same level of complexity that a typical hearing infant would have, for example. So, babbling is super interesting. I think that in language development research, infant speech perception gets a lot more attention than infant babbling. But I think that infant babbling can tell us so much about the precursors to language and what's going on with an infant's developing mind and how they're kind of honing into the environment.
Yeah, I totally agree. It's fascinating. There's so much I didn't know as an SLP, and then getting back into research, I'm like looking into babbling, and it's just really incredible to learn about, stages of babbling, for example, and also how one thing that was really surprising is how kind of robust it is across different individuals. And you do this cool study looking at kind of, and this was with my advisor, and looking at vocal development in a large scale cross linguistic corpus. So I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about the findings here.
Yeah, people have always been really interested in this idea of like, is babbling universal? What does it really reflect? Like, when do infants kind of tune into their native language? So we know that most infants will produce like what we call like universal sequences of sounds like "b" or "m" early in life. So like pretty much no matter what language an infant is exposed to, the lips are like one of the easiest articulators to move. It's much easier to move for an infant than the infant's tongue, in large part because infants' tongues are massive. If you've ever looked on an infant's throat, their tongue is massive. So it's very hard to move. And so it's no mistake that all infants will make babbles with bilabial sounds like "ba" or "ma." But we've always been really interested in like, okay, well, but languages really differ in their phonological structure and in the sounds that are permitted in those languages, in the phonotactics of those languages. Like if a language permits consonant clusters or codas or something like that. And we started, you start wondering like, well, when does that show up in a child's babbling? Because it's not like one day a child is babbling and the next day they're producing words. No, 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 no. It's much more continuous than that. Babbling is tightly related to early word production. So we did this study where we used Lena devices, which are small child-worn audio recorders, and we put those on babies all over the world in that early study, including babies that Ann Worlemont, your advisor, was working with, and including babies that I was working with in Bolivia at the time who were acquiring Quechua. And we did this with several other investigators, and they were looking at babies in places like North America, like Anne, but also looking at babies in places like Bolivia, where I was working. We had babies in Papua New Guinea in that study. We had babies in Chiapas, Mexico in that study, and looking both at how does, in that original study, we actually weren't able to tease apart effects of language structure because we didn't have enough languages yet. But we were really interested in just this basic question, like, there's so much variability in the language structures represented here. One of the languages that's represented, Yeli, that my collaborator Midi Casillas at the University of Chicago collected, her estimate is that it might have 96 contrastive phonemes in it, just for some relevance. English is usually estimated to have somewhere between, depends on the dialect, maybe 30, let's say. So like very different, right? Yeah.
That's crazy.
How does a baby make sense of that? And what we found in that early study was that at least for some of these like basic milestones, all infants do seem to hit these milestones that we had been basing on primarily Western European and North American samples. So milestones like when these canonical babbles should emerge in their speech, milestones like what proportion of their speech could contain canonical babbles. And so now, because we thought that was a very preliminary study, the one that you're talking about, but we've really been able to broaden the kind of network that we have of people who work in all of these different language communities all over the world and use this recording technology that's very tractable. It's not invasive. People can put these recorders on their babies as their babies go about their lives. We do this in a very ethical manner, the way we explain it to families, and I'm happy to talk about that. But basically making data collection tractable across all of these different cultural contexts so that we can understand how a baby's speech is developing as a function of their environment.
I'm still thinking about that 96 phoneme. That's crazy. I had a question thinking about babbling in general, because I remember in the discussion about babbling, they maybe it was in your paper, they brought up that if it's like kind of like motor development, it's like other like walking or crawling or something like that, they see these very clear experience dependent effects. Like some people that they will hold their babies a lot and they tend to crawl later, something like that. So that there are these like cultural differences that they can see quite clearly in the like onset of walking or crawling. But it seems like babbling is kind of more robust to these experience type of things. And yeah, how are you thinking about that? Do you think of it as this like special pathway almost that is less dependent on experience, or maybe that it just requires less experience in general to like kind of get that started? Or
I think it depends on what element of babbling you're studying. So if you're looking at something that's relatively coarse, like just if a baby can produce canonical babbles at all, like reliably, that's a pretty coarse metric, and most babies are going to meet that at roughly the same milestone, or excuse me, at roughly the same age. But we are starting to see some environmental effects on early babbling development. So Kai Jete, who's a PhD student in Paris, has been doing a lot of really interesting work on this front with some of the data that we've collected, and looking at the language, how the specific phonotactic structure of a language might influence the trajectory of babbling development. So looking not just at like, oh, can a baby produce consonant and vowel sequences together by a certain age, but how does the trajectory of speech change over time as a function of the structure of the language that the baby is exposed to? And what we've been finding in our early results from this, because we also just did a meta-analysis of this, is that it actually is true that there is an effect of the phonotactics of the ambient language. And what I mean by phonotactics is, like, if a language allows consonant clusters like stir, right, st, versus a language like Japanese that would only allow a single onset like t, for example. And what we do find is that languages that allow those, that permit those complex consonant clusters, which are obviously harder for a child to articulate, children exposed to languages like that, like English or Polish, they do tend to be a little bit slower at hitting some at their developmental trajectory of babbling than an infant who would be exposed to a language like Hawaiian, for example, that is predominantly just consonants and vowels combined together. So that's an example of how the environment definitely is shaping the trajectory of early speech development. And that, again, was a meta-analysis. So we feel very, very confident in that result.
wow, so cool. Oh yeah. Yeah, that makes sense that if it's more simple input, I guess it's easier to tease out the differences. I was wondering if you could talk a little bit more about this canonical. So I don't know if you mentioned the term, but canonical proportion. So like the proportion of canonical syllables in compared to all the vocalizations in infants' repertoire. And I was wondering how you have some cool, interesting research coming out about how this can be used maybe as a potential evaluation mechanism. I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about that, and then maybe why you think this is a good early measure.
Yeah, so this came from the idea that, so we have this thing called the canonical babbling ratio, right? But everybody knows babies stop babbling, right? Babies start producing words at a certain point, right? And so I started thinking, well, what if we had a metric that was like based on what we know about babbling, which is basically like speech motor development, right? But what if we just like kept measuring that over time? We're not saying that a 4-year-old is babbling. If a 4-year-old is babbling and not producing words, in most cases, they're not typically developing. But what if we just used that metric, just that idea, and we just looked at it in older kids, right? So for one thing, we would expect, of course, that as people get older, that the proportion of these more complex sequences in their speech, just the ability to go ba should increase over time in early development. And it does, right? It does that up until like 6 years. Okay, so we're not saying that babbling is increasing over this time. We're just saying that the complexity of speech, and we can measure it with this relatively like coarse metric of just like constant ratios of consonants and vowels in speech. And so then I had a student at UCLA, and we were thinking where I was before I was at Stanford, and we were thinking, well, if we can see this change over time, right? Maybe we could like do some psychometric testing of this, right? Maybe this will tell us a little bit about how the child's language is developing, right? Because we know that this measure changes over age, and we know lots of other elements of language change over age, not just this like relatively coarse metric of consonants and vowels, but like children's vocabularies grow and their phonological awareness increases. That's like the ability to manipulate um, syllables and sublexical units like that. It's a really important precursor to literacy. We know that children's speech perception capabilities change over time in this age group from like 2 years to 6 years. So I said, what if, but the big bottleneck is, and I think that this is why it probably like piqued your interest. The big bottleneck for all those assessments, vocabulary and speech perception, all that stuff, they take time, right? And kids are annoying, like really hard to work with. And you had, like you bring a kid into the clinic, maybe they're having a bad day, and then their parent forgot to bring a snack, and you don't have a snack, and then everything kind of falls apart. And so like basically we came, even as a non-clinician, I came to understand like we might not be getting the true version of these children's speech and language abilities by bringing them into a clinic for these like semi-artificial 30-minute interactions, right? And kids have limited working memories. They have limited working everything, right? You can't just test and test and test a child for 2.5 hours and expect data. So I thought, all right, so we know this thing like psychometrically that this measure should increase over time. What if we were able to use this like very, very coarse measure of canonical proportion? We could just measure it from a naturalistic speech sample as a child is going about their day. And what could it tell us about that child's vocabulary, right? What could it tell us about how the child's speech perception skills are developing, at what stage they're at? And so that was the project that Carissa Ott and I did at UCLA that she presented this summer. To be able to say, like, if we had just a simple sample of speech, right? A caregiver has a cell phone and they record their child talking. What types of information can we elicit from a very simple sample of speech about how that child's speech and language is developing, if they're on track for development? Kind of like how their vocabulary might be developing, their pre-literacy skills might be developing, all from a single sample of naturalistic speech audio.
Yeah, that's so great. And it's so important too. Like you were mentioning, not only does it take a lot of time and it's hard to work with kids in these like, decontextualized environments, it's really, it struck me that there's so many aspects of these tests that are really like attention based or working memory based and, or executive function tasks or something like that. And it doesn't usually capture what the child actually knows. Like, I'll have kids that will, miss something on the test, and then they're using that word just 5 minutes later in conversation, like in natural conversation. And so I feel like this naturalistic thing is, in a lot of ways way more accurate. And it's cool that you can just use this very, like you were mentioning, coarse grain measure to actually look at all of these different skills like vocab. So very cool. This is a little bit of a side point, but I was wondering there's this word Weltanschauung, which is like your worldview with regards to something, and kind of a weird question, but I was wondering if you have one with regards to speech and language development. So, for example, like Chomsky and universal grammar might be someone's Weltanschauung for speech and language, but how do you think about how language develops and what's going on in the brain?
Oh, you're gonna get me in trouble.
Shay. Yeah, I don't mean it to be too controversial, but
I think I've seen kids in so many different environments now, from our work with children who are deaf to the cross-cultural work that I do. I did like my own field work in Bolivia, watching children acquire language there, and language is not acquired the same way everywhere you go. But one thing that I do think is like innate or universal is a child's like drive to communicate. Almost all children do want to communicate, especially if they're typically developing, and they will find a way to do that. They will find a way to get their point across. Most children, most hearing children will do that through manipulating articulators in their vocal tract, but that is how they will eventually get their point across. But from infancy, in the initial months of infancy, sure, like cries are like a distress signal, but really pretty quickly, anyone who's had an infant will tell you that infants are using those cries to manipulate their environment and get things that they want besides just like basic need like hunger. So I think my worldview is that I don't know. The more I get into this field, the less I am sure about anything. So I won't say whether I am sure that there's a universal grammar or not. But one thing I do know is true about all kids is that they have a drive to communicate and that they will find a path from the language that they hear around them from their caregivers. They will find some kind of wedge to get into that language that they are hearing around them as an infant and eventually develop language.
Yeah, I feel like that's a really important point because we work as SLPs, we work a lot with like behaviorists, and kind of goes against the sort of the traditional behavior paradigm where it's like, just it's all about conditioning or, whatever you reinforce either positively or negatively are the things that get, kind of shaped in a way. But I really do see this like kind of intrinsic drive to communicate in kids that is underexplored. Like that is mysterious. Like what's that intrinsic motivation? Like why are kids wanting to talk and connect socially? And we had Mike Frank on at some point too, and he's saying that a lot of the earliest words that they've looked at across different samples are usually not basic needs words. Like, so they're not like things like, I need my diaper changed or something like that, but they're words about, connection or like just pointing out something cool. These more social words. So I've always kind of felt that, there's this like pretty strong drive to communicate, and it's pretty cool and mysterious. Yeah, maybe we could shift a little bit to your work with deaf and hard of hearing populations. So you did mention this, but just a simple question that came to my mind was, does canonical babbling develop at the same time as hearing children? You mentioned it's a little different, like in terms of quality, but is the timing similar?
A lot of the studies that looked at this conflated the degree of hearing loss in the children. So they were looking at children who had anything from a mild hearing loss to profound deafness. And they were like, children who are deaf babble. But actually, when you really do the careful work of teasing apart infants by the degree of hearing loss that they have, you see big differences even within a population of children who are deaf and hard of hearing, where you'll see children who have mild hearing loss who babble along the same timeline as a child with typical hearing. This, in fact, is, a big problem in pediatric audiology is not necessarily identifying children who have profound hearing loss. Those children, like kids fall through the cracks. Absolutely. There are disparities by race and socioeconomics. But a big problem in pediatric audiology is all the kids with mild hearing loss who fall through the cracks. And no one has any idea, right? Until that kid gets into school, maybe they get like a hearing screening in like kindergarten or first grade or something. And all of a sudden it's like your kid can't hear any high frequency contrast, right? They can't hear any contrast between s and sh. And that's really going to affect your ability in English, for example. It's going to affect your ability to read morphology, the difference between cat and cats or something like that, right? Or cash.
Right.
And that is really, really consequential for language development and speech development. And so the fact that, from a basic science perspective, it is really, really interesting to look at how robust babbling is across children who have these very different sensory experiences. And then in our recent work looking at how then babbling changes after children get cochlear implants, and we can talk about that. But one thing, the fact that you have this finding that all deaf kids babble or something like that is actually very tricky because it can fool parents into not realizing that their child has a hearing loss and that it's affecting their speech and language and socialization and that type of development.
Yeah. We had Nina Kraus on as well at some point, and she was talking about all the ways that even if it's not like, well, what's the word? So you can have like subcortical difficulties with processing sound, like almost like hearing loss that's at the subcortical level that it's like really, really hard to tease out for these kids. And she started to use this metric, the FFR, that she's worked with audiologists to look at some of those kids that fall through the cracks. So yeah, but those really, there are these subtle differences in harmonics and FM sweeps that will change, it says a muddy dog to a muggy bog. Like there are these huge semantic differences that can happen from like these very, very subtle microsecond timing sweeps that can, affect a lot of language. Yeah. You have the study also like on the effects of phonological competition on spoken word recognition. Can you talk a little bit about that? Is that something related?
Yeah, um, I think it is. So, what I was gonna say is that I think the thing that I like to kind of bring home, because the stuff on phonological competition, that study, if you're talking about the one that I think you're talking about, is on children with cochlear implants. But the thing that I think is really important to remember here, so if I can't remember the example you just gave, muddy fog,
Muddy dog, muggy
muddy
bog.
dog,
Yeah.
yeah. Um, um, it, as an adult, if you're listening to that, right, and you think about hearing that phrase in a complete sentence, you might think to yourself, like, I mean, you could probably figure that out by context, right? Right? How difficult could that be? You hear it and you're like, oh, okay. But I want you to like really think about that. I always encourage people to think about life from the perspective of like a 4-year-old. And I want you to really think about like what you're asking a 4-year-old to do in that context, because speech comes out at kids fast, right? Even child-directed speech comes out really fast. And a child being expected to use contextual or additional top-down morphosyntactic cues to resolve semantic ambiguities like that is a really difficult task. And not only is it a difficult task just for like little brains to process, here's the like big difference between studying adults with hearing loss, who like lost their hearing later in life, and kids with hearing loss, because adults with hearing loss are also going to have differences in auditory processing that are going to result in those semantic ambiguities like you just pointed out. But they have a whole lifetime of experience processing spoken language to help them with that. And a 4-year-old is like not only processing that language that's coming at them, they are developing that language at the exact same time. They're acquiring those words, right? Maybe the child didn't know the word fog yet. And so the challenge for a child with hearing loss is like doubly hard, because they have to use those types of cues that you're talking about to resolve a lot of those kind of ambiguities that are inherent in speech, right? That all of us use all the time. And they're doing that while they're acquiring language for the very first time. And so that's why it's such a challenge for children with hearing loss of that age. And it is one of the things that those like kind of like real-time processing, resolving differences is something that we study when we study kids using the eye tracking methods, which was what you were talking about with the phonological competitors.
Oh, cool. Yeah. It amazes me too, because I have to do a lot of like, I'll edit a podcast and I have to listen back. And I realize how many times not only does the auto transcript thing mess up, but how many things that I'm missing and don't get on the first pass, and how many things are actually quite fuzzy. And what I mean by that is like it's kind of noisy when you're listening, but on real time processing, like you're saying, using these other cues to kind of disambiguate. But yeah, those young kids learning language at the same time don't have that experience to really draw on to make the disambiguate stuff. So it's a huge challenge. Maybe we could talk about, so you have a study as well on the everyday speech environments of preschoolers with and without cochlear implants. I thought that these were kind of cool results, because it would seem to me kind of intuitively that if you had some form of hearing loss, that maybe that would be reflected in the environment in some way, in your like how you're back and forth, or how much your parents are talking to you and things like that. But doesn't seem like there was a huge difference in the environments. So yeah, can you talk a little bit about this?
Yeah, we have looked at this a lot, right? And thinking that, so we do things like when we measure the type of language input that kids get, we might be interested in how many words are they hearing from the adults around them. How often are those adults using child-directed speech that's directed right to the target child or another sibling? Metrics like that. How often are the adult and child engaging in any type of like speech interaction? And time again, we do not find differences between children with typical hearing and children who have hearing loss and use cochlear implants. And note that when we do these very carefully designed studies. So when you work with a population like children with cochlear implants, for people who aren't familiar, cochlear implants, children typically don't receive them until sometimes, usually not until maybe like 10, 11, 12 months, often much later. And so, and at that point in time, these are children of severe to profound deafness. And so after they receive their cochlear implants and they're activated, the child has access to sound. It is not the same sound that someone with typical hearing has access to. It is what we refer to as electric hearing. And that's because cochlear implants stimulate the cochlea at discrete points. So it discretizes the speech signal, people can remember that from their phonetics class.
I remember someone saying it's like playing a piano with like oven mitts on.
That's exactly it. Yeah, the analogy that I always give is like, so people who have typical hearing have many thousands of hair cells in their cochlea. That's what allows you to hear. And they encode they help encode different frequencies. So they help tell the difference between like ee, ooh, ah, and that type of thing. But the hair cells are often non-functioning or what have you for an individual with hearing loss. And so the cochlear implant has to take the place of that. But so for you and I, the way that we hear, because we have all these individual hair cells in our inner ear, is it's akin to being able to push individual keys on a piano, right? But for an individual with cochlear implants, because you just have like a series of discrete electrodes, 16 to 20, let's say, instead of the many thousands of hair cells in the inner ear, it's more like you're pushing your whole hand on several keys of the piano, right? And so that's one challenge in like speech perception through a cochlear implant.
Yeah. So you're discussing these results from the study about hearing experience for these two groups, like the typical hearing group and then the cochlear implant group. And even though you didn't find a huge difference between the speech environments and like the adult input and the interactions, there was a difference in output, like certain aspects of output, right? Like vocalization duration. What do you think is driving that difference? Is it like auditory feedback or something like that?
Yeah, I think that that's a lot of what's going on there. And so basically what we're finding is like, well, the language that the kids are exposed to doesn't really vary by their hearing status. Like basically parents are not necessarily changing the way that they're talking to their child, whether or not they have cochlear implants. And the language that the children are exposed to and the quantity of it, and how often they're engaging with caregivers, we don't find like large differences. But the children's own output does seem to matter. And so I think that this comes back to, there's a saying in deaf education that if a deaf child isn't looking at you, they're not hearing you. And that's meaning that like it's important to establish like eye contact with a child so that they can like see your mouth, for example, for spoken language, or for sign language so that they can see your hands. And so I think for the children with hearing loss in that study, I think that there are differences in their responsiveness to their caregivers, for example. That there are differences in their own speech maturity, certainly. We've already documented that in other works. But I think that in their case, I think that it was a lot of I go back to that, saying from deaf education that the children, there is just as much language available to the children, but they're not necessarily able to take advantage of all the typical hearing child would be able to. And
I
so
see.
their ability to respond to it.
Got it. So in this case, do you think that more would help, or is it like kind of is the bottleneck elsewhere? Like, so would more input, for example, do you think that would make a difference in language outcomes?
Or I think like if I am not an audiologist, but I do try to educate myself and have many conversations with them. I think really emphasizing the importance of for spoken language, like really clear input in the home. So parents often ask us about like, is an FM system really that important? So the FM system is, it can come in a variety of forms, but it is often sort of like a microphone that you might wear, almost like a necklace. And nowadays, a caregiver might wear that, or a teacher might wear that in a classroom. And rather than the caregiver or teacher's voice resounding out into the entire classroom and getting absorbed by furniture and carpet and having to compete with overlapping voices from other children or a TV, that caregiver speech input gets directed via Bluetooth right to the child's device. So you kind of like cut off the middle person and the child gets access to a very clear signal from their adult. So emphasizing things like the importance of FM systems, which of course audiologists would say are very important and relevant. I think that would be like a really important mechanism to improve the type of length accessible to a child with hearing loss. Not necessarily the quantity, but like the type of language, like competing with noise. Is there a TV background? Can a child tell that you're talking to them, right? Can they hear you okay?
Yeah, hearing is so underappreciated. Like I remember seeing like there's I think it was Nina was showing this graph of neuronal responses with competing noise, and like it's not like a graded response. It doesn't get slightly worse. It's like a little bit of noise is okay, and then at a certain threshold, you don't get anything really. Like, and so yeah, I remember, I could be butchering these studies, but there's some studies where they had classrooms, for example, that were, I think these are all typical hearing kids, but they there was one like
Train
a
track them?
classroom, yeah, on the side of the train tracks, and they had worse language outcomes. It's like correlative, but very interesting. And there's another with like they're using those FM units, right? For
Yeah,
the
and
kids.
also there's also an airport one, which I think is actually better, even better than the train track one. When someone can correct me on this, I'm happy to be corrected. But it actually was like a natural experiment. I think the train track one might have been a natural experiment because I think halfway through the year they ended up having to move the classroom so that it was further away from the train tracks or it was something like so it was even like same classroom, same teacher, and the children's outcomes were like much better relative to baseline because they weren't competing with the like really noisy train tracks outside their classroom. But I am happy to be corrected on the exact details of that particular study.
Yeah, and we tune out noise so quickly now in our kind of increasingly noisy world. And yeah, it's weird how many times like, a fan will stop like, or something like that. And I just feel like relief and like, oh, that was on the whole time. I mean, even that, I think there's some effect on our physiology. Any other tips for SLPs working with DHH populations?
Well, I'm sure there are people who are much better qualified than me to talk about. One thing that I will say, just like from a science perspective, one thing that we're actively studying and I'm always very interested to get, I work very closely with my clinicians. I employ them in my lab. I love hearing from clinicians and hearing what questions they have. So please email me, call me, come have a meeting with me at Stanford. You're very welcome. I love getting the perspective of clinicians. One thing that we are actively studying right now is the extent to which preschoolers who are deaf and hard of hearing, to what extent their use of audiovisual cues from the face assists with spoken language development. So as you and I know, the audiovisual cues when we're producing speech, so like cues from the position of our lips, are very important for speech perception. Anecdotally, now everybody has an appreciation for how important audiovisual cues are because everybody had the experience of COVID. And so didn't have cues from the lips. Everyone was like, huh?
Yeah.
Right? And one of the reasons why speech perception with a mask is hard is because you can't use the lips to disambiguate sounds.
It's like the McGurk effect, right?
Yeah, it's parts of it, yes.
Okay.
So, everybody uses these cues from the lips, okay? Even if you think you don't, right? People are like, oh, I don't lip read. You do. A part of you does, right? For some speech sounds. But people with hearing loss, it is well known, rely more on those cues, right? Of course, because it's going to help them in the absence of really strong spectral or temporal cues from the speech signal itself. They will rely on the position of the lips to help disambiguate, for example, maybe like some vowels, right? Ooh, or an ah, or something like that. But for kids, we also know that they tend to rely a little bit more on those cues, right? I would be curious, right, if there was a poll done for speech therapists, particularly speech therapists who do and do not specialize in working with DHH populations, which ones of them say that it's important to teach a child with hearing loss how to take advantage of cues from the lips versus which ones would tell you that you should do therapy with a mask over the lips? so that a child can't rely on them and that they have to.
Mm.
I bet that therapists would be split because the science is split. The science is not completely about if audiovisual cue use helps spoken language development,
I see.
or if there's a certain point where
They
some
start relying on it, and then
rely on
they.
it too much.
Oh, interesting. Yeah. If anyone wants to chime in, feel free to. Wow. That is really interesting. What is your thought?
I am not a clinician, so I don't have to have thoughts on this. I just get to think of the basic science and then report the results, and then clinicians can tell me what they think from their own lived experience.
I don't have experience working much with these populations. Yeah, so I don't really have a say, but I did get someone raising their hand. I don't know if I can't see who it was now. I don't know, it went down. This is kind of tangential, but there was a study that I read that looked at other, not just using lip cues to disambiguate sounds, but like environmental cues too. So there's one study where they think they had to disambiguate like ba and pa or something like that. And the only cue that they had was like whether or not a candle like was being pushed, like the flame on a candle was being pushed. And it turned out that people used like this very subtle cue of like the air pushing the candle forward to like disambiguate sounds. And I was like, wow, that's kind of crazy. Yeah. Maybe you can talk a little bit about your, you've worked with like really diverse linguistic environments, and you're talking about your background, interested in different languages like the Chimane. Have you found anything about these languages that have challenged or expanded your understanding of speech or language?
Yeah, just like in some fun ways, like in Quechua, there's a type of speech sound called an ejective. An ejective is a sound that we don't we don't have it phonemically in English. You do sometimes produce it in some context in English without realizing it. But basically you make like to use like a non-scientific way to describe it, you make it like a very firm constriction in your vocal tract. So if you wanted to make an ejective with your lips, you would close your lips very, very tightly and let a whole bunch of air build up behind your lips and then let it out. So you make a sound like,
Okay. Beatboxers will know about that.
yeah. And you can make it at a variety of locations on the in the vocal tract. Like you could make it with the tip of your tongue. You can make it with the back of your tongue, like a sound. So I don't know what the typological frequency of ejectives are. They're not like uncommon, but like they're not like a p sound, right? Or a t sound, which is like most languages of the world have p and t.
Mm.
So in linguistics, we have this kind of thing where we say, well, if certain sounds are more common in the world languages, there has to be a reason for that. So often we'll say that it's because kids have an easier time acquiring those sounds. Because if they were hard to acquire, then maybe those sounds would not like last in the languages over many generations. So ejectives, I thought when I started working on Quechua has lots of ejectives, that I was like, this is going to be a sound that these kids are going to have a really hard time with because ejectives are not that common of a sound cross-linguistically. They are definitely present. You will definitely find ejectives in language, but they are not ubiquitous. Oh man, these little 3-year-olds can really produce ejectives. I was like very surprised. I don't think I don't have like tons and tons of controlled speech samples from like 2-year-olds, but I definitely have them from 3-year-olds, and like they have got them down. It is not a challenge. So I've always wanted to, someday, maybe I think like if there's a student interested, to look at like how ejectives.
That's so cool.
Because it's not a super typologically common type of sound, and so we don't really have any understanding about we don't have a strong understanding, I would say, about how it develops, as opposed to like we know lots and lots about how the sounds that are common to like English and French develop, right? So we like the sound in American English develop late, and we know that sounds like develop very early, but we don't really know about some of these like less typologically, or I should say less common in Western European languages, we don't always know how those sounds develop. So that was very fun to get to hear little 3-year-olds very confidently make these like adjective sounds.
Yeah. Um, I was talking with Greg, who's the communication department head at UCLA recently. And at some point he mentioned like they're doing some studies on kids making animal sounds, like young kids. And before a certain point, they're actually like some of them are like hyper accurate. Like they can make the sounds more accurately than an adult might. And I just thought that was so interesting because it sort of suggests, just like in our perception of speech sounds or phonemes, when, before a certain age, we can like, hear a whole range of distinctions, 96. And then at a certain point, you start to narrow down on the ones that are relevant to your language. I feel like the same thing with like animal sounds. You probably hear them with a little more clarity than after, hearing that a dog says like woof, a million times. And then so whenever you try to do a dog bark, like bark or woof or something like that. So yeah, that's interesting. I think humans have more capacity than we give ourselves credit for sometimes.
Yeah, kids will surprise you.
Yeah. And beatboxers too. Like I've been lucky enough to be friends with some world champion beatboxers, and the like up training of speech motor articulation stuff, the ceiling is so much higher than I would have ever imagined. I'll have to look at adjectives or listen to them after. So you use a lot of different methodological tools, like FNIRs and all kinds of stuff. And you started doing in that study, looking at the different environments. For example, you were using citizen scientists rating, right? So you've just done a whole bunch of different stuff. What excites you kind of about where the field is going in terms of integrating these different tools with real world speech data?
I'm really excited that we're going to be able to get um, both larger in terms of quantity, but also larger in terms of kind of like the representation, larger data sets. So I, as you know, because we have discussed, I am marrying into an Indian family. I'm going to India to get married in a couple months, and I am learning my fiance's home language. And so I started thinking, I'm a linguist. This seems like a good opportunity to get involved with this. And so I'm starting a new collaboration that's really, really exciting to me in my fiance's town in India, where we will be. My colleague there is a clinician. She's a clinical speech language pathology professor. And so our eventual goal is she sees a lot of children with autism from all over, including very rural areas, very underserved areas in India, who come to her clinic. And so our goal is to make like a very robust language assessment toolkit that can assess kids whose families have varying levels of familiarity with technology and literacy. And also for the context of India, my colleague there has this really beautiful line that I think encapsulates the linguistic environment in India really well, which is, she said, for a lot of families, like families in Montreal, she says, bilingualism is a choice. And she says that in India, bilingualism it's just baked into the cake. It's not like a decision that like one parent says, I'm going to speak this language, and another parent says, language. It's just, there is English on TV, and there's also Hindi in movies, and there's also 2 different languages spoken in the home, and there's also a grandparent maybe speaking one language, and maybe you go to school in a different language. And so it is not uncommon for many people to speak 4 or 5 languages in this context, and for kids to be exposed to that many languages. And so that brings up all kinds of questions for my colleague, who is a clinician, and me, who just works with clinicians and tries to learn from them, about how do you assess children who have such a varied multilingual background that's very hard to quantify? How do you assess children whose parents are not literate? How do you assess children and serve them in a way that will allow their speech and language to develop if you only get to ever see them maybe once or twice because the family has to travel so far? So that's one of our big goals, like a big long-term multi-year goal, is to have this kind of very mobile language assessment toolkit that's very tractable across many different cultural linguistic contexts. And we're starting small. We're starting just developing an MBCDI for some of these languages in India that doesn't exist yet. So this is a vocabulary checklist. It's very, very common, and it's already been developed for, oh gosh, I don't know, 50 languages, something like that. But it has been really robustly developed for several languages, particularly in South India. And so we're starting with that and validating that and doing that work, and then slowly building from there about like how do we assess multilingual exposure for these children who have such different early level experiences than the children that we tend to study in our baby labs in North America, in Montreal, in Cambridge, Massachusetts, and Paris, France. And so that's a project that I think will have a lot of public health relevance for the children and their families in India. And also I think will make a major basic science contribution because we'll have a better understanding about how a child could make sense of it being exposed to so many different languages and how these children manage to develop competence in multiple languages simultaneously and their preparedness for school and stuff like that.
That's so beautiful. Do you think that the CP measure could be helpful potentially?
I absolutely think it could. That one of the beautiful things about that measure is that it is cross-linguistically robust. So I had two amazing students at UCLA who we built a child speech maturity classifier to automate the computation of canonical proportion over a child speech sample. So that means there's no hand coding involved, which would not be tractable. And that was trained over many, many different languages, and not just different languages typologically in terms of their structure, but languages of kids growing up in very different types of environments. So like kids in North America have these kind of like, a lot of kids are like, have these very sterile environments where like there's carpet on the floor, there's one caregiver, and it's like maybe there's a TV in the background. But that's not the actual language learning environment of lots of kids in the world. Lots of kids in the world maybe spend a lot more time outside. Lots of kids in the world are raised by multiple different caregivers. So they're getting lots and lots of speech input, but from many different people. Maybe they're getting proportionally more of their speech input from older siblings, for example. And so the great thing about the classifier that we worked on was that it is robust to a lot of those environments. And so we're hoping that additional tools like that are literally not, and we would deep learning algorithm, it's literally not trained on English. It is trained, right? And so we want to make sure that additional tools like the ones that we're going to be working on for this kind of robust language assessment toolkit are likewise not honed in on one context, not honed in on one particular learning environment or one particular language, but from the get-go, right? Not that we first develop it for English, not that we first develop it for in Hindi and then go from there, but that from the get-go we're working on tools that could be used in a variety of settings, and that's baked into the cake. But it requires us to think of tools in a very different way than I think that we've been thinking about them traditionally.
It's so beautiful. Something I care about a lot too. You're mentioning that the story of someone growing up with a bunch of different languages. Like my wife's from Malaysia, and she was going to school in Japanese, and then she was going home and listening to Bollywood movies and talking to her grandma in Hindi, and then her mom was speaking English, and then there was Malay, and so it was like all of these language all over the place, and there wasn't a clear separation. And then living in Malaysia for a little bit, I found out that there's only like 300 registered speech therapists, and like kids are waiting years for an evaluation. And like something like this would be so incredibly beneficial, and I think it would change a lot of lives. So yeah, we can are excited for what's to come with these measures. Yeah, thank you so much, Meg. You're an inspiration, and thank you for your work. I'll open it up for we have a few more minutes. So if anyone has questions, feel free to ask. But if do you have any asks of our small speech therapy audience?
Oh, I just want to say that, I am so happy to hear from therapists, and that it genuinely does inform a lot of the work that we do. I collaborate very closely with audiologists, otolaryngologists, speech language pathologists. I employ them in my lab. So just to say, like, if you ever have ideas, if you ever have questions, if you ever have something like, I wonder, like, could you ever like study something like this? Yes, I could. I would write a grant about it. So it's really great that we love having those types of conversations. And we run a satellite lab at a deaf and hard of hearing preschool in Los Angeles. And so we are really, really interested in giving back to the community. We hold public events there. We speak to families directly, and it's just a huge portion, a huge part of our research program. And just to say, if you email us, I will email you back. If you ever find yourself in Palo Alto, I'm happy to go to coffee with you and hear about kind of your experience, because it really does inform the science that we do.
Awesome. And where can they reach you if
You can email me. You can, if you can
I will?
figure out how to spell my last name, you can.
It's a tricky one. I will put it in the chat. I have
Um,
it.
yeah, but you can definitely email me, and I'm happy to get in touch and hear from clinicians and things that they encounter.
Fantastic. Anything, you mentioned what you're excited about studying and the project you're working on, but any other like conclusions you'd like to leave us with?
Um, no, I don't think so. I think that this has been a really, really great conversation. I really enjoyed, getting to kind of like encapsulate a lot of the things. Sometimes in research, this is my advice if there's any like people in graduate school, you're in graduate school. So this is my advice, that sometimes these projects that you're working on, they feel like they go nowhere. Sometimes they feel like they're so not related to one another. Um, Sometimes you feel like, I felt this way in graduate school, that like, you're like, is this ever going to amount to anything? None of this makes sense. But there's always a story to be told about your research program. Sometimes it takes many years to get to the point where you start to see the connections between the different things that you're doing, but it's always there. And so I think getting a lot of perspective from people outside of your field. I have a PhD in theoretical linguistics, and I would say that I've branched out substantially from that. So don't be afraid of that, because it will make your science much, much stronger, and it'll make you finally see those connections between those things that when you're a first or second year PhD student and you're just getting started out and you have like one project or two projects, or even when you're deep in your dissertation, that you really don't see where it's all going. But that's my advice for any graduate students out there.
Oh, that hit hard here. I definitely resonate with that. I feel like sometimes I'm just out in no man's land and I'm doing so many different things that it doesn't make sense. Yeah. Thank you for that reframe. Yeah, I guess, what would your story, you mentioned like your story coming together. What would yours be? This could be our last question, but how would you tell your story?
Pure luck. Absolutely pure luck. But
I don't know about that.
no. I know how I would tell it. I got lucky with collaborators. I got really, really lucky with collaborators. I one of my main collaborators, she's the one who introduced me to your advisor, Anne. One of my main collaborators is Alex Christia. And I saw her give a plenary. So go to all the plenaries. That's another piece of advice. I saw her give a plenary at a conference, maybe my second year of graduate school.
Yep. What is a plenary? Sorry, I don't
Like
mean to cut you off.
like a big, the big talk that everybody goes to at the conference, right? So you might break out into other rooms at a conference, but then everybody comes together for the plenary. And I wasn't even working with kids. I didn't even really think like that was the thing I could do. And I saw her give a talk, and she gave a talk about this new technology she was going to try using. She was going to go to Bolivia, and she was going to put these little recorders on kids, and she was going to see, that was like the gist of her talk. Like, she was like, I'm going to figure out how to do this. And I was like, I have to meet this woman. I have to work with this woman. Yeah. And she became like just an incredible mentor to me. And she introduced me to all these other people. And it very much changed the course of my scientific career. So, Alex, if you're listening, she already knows this, but she did change the course of my life. So,
Sweet. Yeah. So you heard it. Go to the plenary, go to the talk,
plenary.
meet people. And yeah, we're getting some comments coming in. Thank you so much for the course, for your research, and best blessings in your marriage. Shout out to KK. And thank you so much. Yeah, I really appreciate you sitting down to talk with us. It's been so valuable. I've learned so much. And yeah, thank you again for your time. Thanks, everyone. Take care, and I hope to see you in the next episode. All right, everyone. Bye-bye.